evening and thanks for staying with us here in the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate. We're going to talk about fuel prices one more time. And this is because the petrol and diesel prices have increased for the 6th day in a row. They have now touched levels in most cities which are the highest in the past 2 years. These are the kind of prices we last saw in November 2018. That doesn't mean that they crashed at some point. Even when globally the crude prices had tanked, were at rock bottom, the people in our country didn't get that kind of relief in their fuel prices. Yet, as the crude prices now begin to go up day after day, we are looking at prices across cities now beginning to inch up day after day. Petrol price in Delhi is at 83.71. In Mumbai, it's gone beyond 90 rupees per litre, 90.34 rupees per litre. Diesel too has gone beyond 80.5 per litre now. In fact, just in the last 2.5 weeks, there has been a 2.5 rupees increase in petrol, 3.5 rupees increase in diesel prices. Now, the question I'm going to ask our panelists tonight, and it's a mix of politicians and experts, economic experts, is should the government, central and states, should they step in and provide the relief to the common man? And I ask this question because this has been an unprecedented year. This has been a year where we've been in lockdown for weeks together, where businesses have been shut, factories have been shut, layoffs have taken place, salary cuts have taken place. People are already under a lot of economic pressure. This has been a year where the pandemic and the lockdown itself has made our lives extremely difficult. This has been a year where we've officially gone into a recession, which means that now for 2 straight quarters, our economy has been contracting, and it's been contracting. And how? Instead of growing, we are shrinking. In such a time, in such an unprecedented situation, should the government step in and give some relief to the people? Remember, it's not just about driving a car. It's also about the fuel prices that decide the prices of every other essential and every other commodity that has to be transported. There is an inflation impact that happens when prices go up in such a manner. But here is the other argument, which is why it's an interesting debate. Where will the government give you relief from? Because the businesses are down and the economy is down, the government also doesn't have the money. That is why not just the central government, but also the state governments have increased the taxes on fuel even this year. So if that is the case, can the government afford to give any relief on the fuel prices? Let's say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now on this conversation. Anshul Avijit, National Spokesperson for the Congress Party. Viswas Pathak, Spokesperson for the BJP. Professor Aman Agarwal, Director and Professor for the Indian Institute of Finance. And Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Senior Economist, joining us this evening. But let me first go across to Anshul Avijit on this one, because your party just a few days ago, Anshul, raised this issue. Now, why do you believe it is the central government's responsibility to do anything?
I mean, if you've just seen the pattern of the central government, the Modi Sarkar over the past couple of months, reeling under the pandemic, I mean, it's a highly extractive and unconscionable move by this unabated and relentless rise of petrol prices. This is not just rhetoric, I'm saying. You know, if I recall, and I want to take you back to a point on the 30th of June, when Dharmendra Pradhan, the petroleum minister, made a very telling statement. It wasn't highlighted enough, but he said that the increase in excise duty of the government is so that we can give more money for the Garib Kalyan Yojana of the Pradhan Mantri. I mean, look at that particular statement. What it was in effect trying to say was that through this duplicitous maneuver, through this sleight of hand, you are actually taking money from the poor people and giving them back to them in the form of a gift. Whether you're actually giving them back to them or not is a different question altogether. But this is a highly extractive maneuver by the government, completely and totally lazy and complacent. So where you take money, you make the public bleed, and then you try and suggest that we're giving it back to you through these kind of schemes. Another point, I mean, there is no shortcut to the government, monetizing our deficit, printing more money, and increasing some kind of or introducing some kind of a demand side stimulus. All what you have is a supply side stimulus. There is no shortcut for putting money in the hands of the poor people. Instead, you're doing the actual reverse. I mean, what can justify what is going on when there is such an increase in petrol prices, when the Brent crude prices all over the world have fallen or have seen such a precipitous decline?
Yeah.
Completely unconscionable. I mean, we demand immediately a rollback in this.
So, okay, let me get Viswas Pathak to respond to that. Mr. Pathak, at a time when you need to put money in the hands of people so that they spend more and our economy starts growing again, you are making them pay more for fuel.
Tanvi, this government is committed to pay to the poor. That's under our Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Money has gone to the pockets of the poor people only under Pradhan Mantri Yojana or many other Yojana to the extent 97,000 crores. Plus 2 lakh crore more has been infused for these people only. Now see, whenever such prices go up, there is a reason for demand and supply. In COVID period, there was a less demand of oil, therefore production was also less. Yesterday only Petroleum Minister Mr. Pradhan, he has informed that OPEC has agreed to produce around 5 lakh barrels per day. So once production goes up, prices will stabilize, things will be normalized. Now whenever such help is required, this government is always committed to reduce the prices also. Like in 2018, in Maharashtra, when government of Mr. Devendra Fadnavis was there, we reduced the prices by 2 rupees 50 paisa and central government by 2 rupees 50 paisa. So 5 rupees relief was given.
Mr. Pathak, are you saying that the prices will only come down where the crude prices come down? Crude prices at the level of $40 to $45 per barrel is down. It's not up. We've seen times when the prices of crude have gone to $90 per barrel. They've gone to $110 and $130 per barrel. So that's when you reach 100 rupees per litre or more, not at 45.
Then we see traditionally got its own construct of recurring revenue. Look at Hong Kong, look at UK, or look at Netherlands and Italy. They are selling petrol at 140 rupees to 180 rupees per litre. They are developed countries. There are some poor countries which are selling petrol at lesser also. So it all depends how you are planning your revenue.
Correct.
In
so
India,
now let's say that
we have been banking on petroleum products.
Yes, Mr. Pathak, now you are talking. Let's say that. Let's be honest about it. This is more about bringing in revenues for the government when your options are limited. It's not to, then don't blame the crude for it, because that hardly has a role to play. I can very clearly, I have the statistics here.
It's worldwide.
No, it's not about worldwide. Worldwide, the prices don't go up and continue to go up the way it is for us.
Tell me.
Yes.
Can you tell me why in UAE there is no fuel sold at 0 rupees when production is taking place there only? They are also charging 40 rupees, 45 rupees per litre. Again, I am telling you, there is a traditional construct for every country. Now look at what has happened in Corona.
Mr. Viswas Pathak, that's not even a comparable thing to do. What other countries charge themselves. If we had to go on that, we will start counting the taxes. I am giving you one simple statistic. Let me give you one simple statistic to the argument that you are making. In 2014, the excise on petrol was 9.48 rupees per litre. In 2020, as of May, I believe, the excise on petrol was 32 rupees per litre. That is the difference. For excise on diesel was 3.5 rupees per litre in 2014 when the Modi government came to power the first time. The excise on diesel in 2020 is 31.8 rupees. So anybody who says it's largely because of crude prices is misleading the people. Now let's come to the merits of this decision. You said about revenues, I take that argument. I will take that argument and go across to Mr. Santosh Mehrotra. Good evening to you, Mr. Mehrotra. where the government doesn't have options of money coming in.
You talk something, let me respond now.
I didn't ask you. Okay, what do you want to respond on?
Now.
Yes. What is the response, Mr. Pathak? I am adding to the point you're making.
I want to refer to two things that you need to understand. In 2014, there was a arrears of 3 lakh rupees oil bonds to be repaid. This government repaid it. Thereafter, on developmental activities, government repaid it. I fully agree, government issued bonanza through oil prices going down. But that money was utilized for the betterment of public only. So this is called planning. This is called fiscal planning.
Okay. Okay, point taken. I am not even arguing with you on the revenue aspect right now. This is your fiscal planning. This has been your government and your party's strategy from day one, Mr. Santosh Mehrotra, to say we're going to charge you more, we're going to tax you more and use that to fund our schemes. But the question is, when the economy is in a recession and businesses are down and out, at that point, should we be charging people this much?
Of course not. It is obvious that if oil prices have fallen from the 2014 levels, and if at the same time, on account of economic mismanagement, obviously by the government, there is an economic crisis much worse than would have been predicted by a COVID lockdown and a COVID pandemic. And if the government was already facing a fiscal crisis 1 year ago, I want to repeat, the government was already facing a fiscal crisis 1 year ago, despite global oil prices having fallen because of its own mismanagement. For 9 quarters, the economy before March of 2020 had been slowing down. Revenues were going down, which is the reason why the shock treatment that the entire economy isn't subjected to since the pandemic has only led to a contraction which is worst of any G20 country. So the crisis, which was already there at the beginning of 2019, has simply become worse. And I have to say the fiscal crisis by 2019 had been created not just by the slowing of the economy, but because of tax cuts that this government went on. First, just before the elections were about to be held in 2019, in the budget, the government raised the threshold for personal income tax from 2.5 lakhs to 5 lakhs. Thus, when the threshold was only 2.5 lakhs, the number of personal income tax payers was 60 million, 6 crore. When you raise the personal income tax threshold to 5 lakhs, the number of taxpayers fell by 45 million, 4.5 crore का fall हुआ. जो direct taxes में loss हुआ, वो उसकी जिम्मेदारी किसकी है? पहली बात. दूसरी बात, when in July, the government's fiscal crisis of 2019, the fiscal crisis had actually become worse. The government actually reduces corporate tax rate from 30% to 25%. Thereby, in one shot, losing 1.45 lakh crores per annum. And for no rhyme or reason, because the corporates did not respond by raising investments.
Yes.
Not at all.
Yes.
Investment continued to fall until the end of 2019-20. So you make mistakes in an already deepening fiscal crisis, in a slowing economy. In order to win elections, you raise the threshold for personal income tax, then you cut corporate tax rate. The interesting thing, Tanvi, is that this reduction from 30% to 25% was promised by the government in 2015 by the Finance Minister Jaitley Sahab. And they had said that 1 percentage point reduction will take place in the corporate income tax to bring our rate comparable to the East Asian competitors. It did not happen for 5 years. And it happens when the fiscal crisis is really deepened for the government and for the country. The government is fiscally bankrupt. And the government is doing with these diesel and the petrol prices the opposite of what it should be doing, because we know that what has happened to inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation is already running at 7% for this entire year. Before COVID, inflation was still running. at well over 7%, 6%, which is over the threshold or the range that the RBI is comfortable with, which is 2 to 6%. And food inflation is running at nearly 10%. Why?
Yes.
Because petrol and diesel prices keep rising.
Yes, that's what I also said at the beginning, Mr. Mehrotra, and that's a fair point that you've made, because often the argument that's given is, oh, if somebody can afford a car, they can afford to pay the price for fuel as well.
Tanvi,
But
I
it's
want to
also
come in.
people who are buying food, which gets impacted as well because of high prices. Viswas Pathak wants to respond before I go across to Aman Agarwal. Yes.
I want to correct this gentleman what he spoke about. First of all, UK and as economy is comparable. UK is selling petrol at 150 rupees. Why? We need to understand. Secondly, when in 2014 the Modi government took over, our economy was up to 2 trillion, whereas by 2019 it is 3 trillion. Now, while doing this journey, income tax rates were never hiked. However, income tax collection has gone up. Please check your records. Indirect taxes, which was average 23%, has come down below 18% because of removing the cascading effect, introducing GST. Still, collection has gone up. See, development is happening, economy is growing. It is not without any revenue. Therefore, I just want to correct what gentleman said just now.
Okay. Mr. Viswas Pathak's point there taken, but Mr. Aman Agarwal, you've heard what all of our panelists have said. On the other hand, when the government has no money at all, not getting in their tax revenues, we're just about seeing some kind of uptick and revival in their tax collections. What option does the government have? Mr. Santosh Mehrotra is also saying that. Professor Mehrotra says that they are now fiscally bankrupt. We've reached that point. What's the solution then?
Okay, Tanvi, I've heard. Let me talk about the fuel economics which goes behind and what goes on before all governments, including the government of India. First of all, the fuel is the biggest fueler to the revenues of any government, whether it is India, United States, or a rich country or a poor country. So that's something which needs to be very well understood by all economists, that it gives the largest chunk. In a country like India, from state to state, the fuel revenue in terms of the tax loading which takes place varies between 55% to 75%, varying from state to state. Now, that is the level of taxation which is in the per liter of fuel which any buyer buys, whether it is diesel or petrol. That is one thing to be understood. Secondly, it's important to be understood that it seems that the bureaucracy is able to, or the oil companies as a matter of fact, are able to deceive the ministerial concerns in the cabinet, not only in this government, and even in the previous government, in the sense that most oil which is bought by any economy is bought in a long-term contract, which ranges earlier when Saddam Hussein used to be there, which ranges into 20 years, like the Prime Minister signed for the gas recently with the United States when he went in the Howdy Modi period, or it now ranges between 3 to 5 years span. So there is a price at which large chunk, almost to the tune of 90 to 95% of the consumption of an oil of an economy on a day-to-day basis is actually projected and bought in terms of contracts. Those are called normal trade forward contracts, which are signed by governments with some of these oil companies in different countries around the world. According to some estimates, that averaging is around $60 a barrel, which we have been buying. So immediate shrinking of the price does not make it lower. Similarly, a going up of the price does not make it go up. However, this government in the earlier stance earlier this year did raise the price, and at that time I did support, given the fact that we were going deflationary in nature and there was a deflationary pressure. To counter that kind of an inflationary pressure was appropriate. But given the fact that December 2019, internationally, at the Brent or WTI or even the OPEC basket price was ranging around $68.89 a barrel, whereas today it is ranging around $40 to $43 a barrel, had gone down to almost $18 a barrel in February 20 because there were no takers. So the reduction was not granted by the government, and the oil companies did not reduce the price when the prices fell down so extremely. Now, where is the cause for them to raise it up on a day-to-day basis? Certainly, there is one factor which is there, but that cannot contribute for a period of next 3 months, because the oil supplies, before it lands your shore, takes any 2 to 3 months before the prices land. Then that factor is that most of the OPEC countries were producing oil at 7.7 barrels per day, as against 5.8 million barrels per day as of today. So there is a shrunk, and that is natural, because large number of oil companies internationally had seen that large chunk of oil was lying on the shores in the month of March, April, May, whereas it was not being offloaded to various countries, including India, primarily the reason of the pandemic crisis and the economies being under lockdown in large part of the world. And as a result, large number of oil companies had to bear a huge chunk of loss, and they had no option but to reduce their production capacity to a lower level so as to keep their engines on roll.
But Professor Agarwal, at no point did any of that pass on to the people.
Let me just take half a minute more, Tanvi, before you can draw conclusions and go forward. As I said earlier, the largest chunk of basket of revenue for any government, whether it is this government or the one prior to 2014, or it is United States or a country like Vietnam or Thailand, comes from the oil sales. And that is where, given that revenues have shrunk in large part of the baskets from where it comes, this government is also enriching itself in terms of getting it up, not understanding the long-term effect. Any short-term effect of such nature does not build into a huge pressure. But if this long-term effect, like we have been seeing for the last 1.5 years, continues, and the government does not give a relief which it ought to give as of this stage, then it will rebound into other factors. I'm sorry, I will not like to go into the economic factors which Professor Malhotra raised, which is 2.5 lakhs and 5 lakhs. That figure is wrong, because only that 5 lakhs was anyone having an income did not need to pay taxes. The threshold was not raised to 5 lakhs. So that should be very clear. So that information should be corrected from that point, but that has nothing to do with oil consumption or the oil economy. And that is where I thought I should let you know, given the topic which is on the fuel.
Okay, thank you for the explanation that you've given. Now, if I can just move to the second aspect as well, and I want to ask all of our representatives on that, all of our panelists on that. One, of course, is to say, well, if the crude prices go up, your fuel and diesel prices in your country will also go up, petrol and diesel prices. What we have seen is that it's not gone up or come down proportionately. The crude prices have crashed multiple times during this government's tenure, but the petrol and diesel prices haven't come down accordingly. Now, every time we are told that's because we are going to tax you more, we need the tax money, we need the money to run the country, we don't have the money from other sources, so we're going to increase these taxes and not give you the benefit of falling crude. That's how the movement has been taking place so far. So, Anshul Avijit, can you tell me, in how many of the Congress-governed states have you seen any cuts in taxes when the fuel prices have gone up? I am looking at a list of different states who have increased the taxes on fuel during the time of lockdown. So, which Congress-governed state did differently?
That's not a fair question, Tanvi, because what we're trying to do is de-link the rise in fuel prices from the pandemic itself. Now, we all know what happened during the pandemic and the lockdown and how badly the states were affected in financial terms. What the central government should do and what the state government should do in terms of a crisis like this, in terms of increasing the excise duty, which has risen exponentially, are two separate things. They cannot be conflated. So these are qualitatively different answers.
Why? Okay. Why is that? Why is it that the state governments are allowed to increase their taxes, but the central government shouldn't?
No, because again, I do not want to de-link the pandemic as far as how far badly the states have been affected by the pandemic, with no revenues whatsoever during the lockdown. The GST is not forthcoming, and therefore their inability to do any room for maneuver at all. It's wrong to conflate the two issues.
No,
where
I'm
the
sorry, I
responsibility-
disagree with you. It's not.
Tanvi,
It's the same problem. The same problem for the states
no,
or the
I
center.
will explain
There
to
is
you. I
lack
will
of
explain to
money.
you why.
You need
I
to
will
be,
explain to you the
if
political
you say
reasons.
there has to be a cut in tax, fuel tax to give the relief to the Aam Aadmi, then all political parties and all state governments and the central governments have to be innovative in the way they generate their taxes and their money.
The policies
They
are
have to
controlled.
be
The
innovative.
excise
Your
duty is the
simple,
bulk of
if your simple solution is going to be to increase fuel tax every time you need more money, then that's how it's going to
The
be,
state
whether it's
cannot be
state or the
asked to
center.
pay for the mismanagement, the profound mismanagement of this government, the Congress states in particular, this mismanagement which was spoken about by Professor Malhotra over the past few years. These are self-conflicted wounds. There is not even just a fiscal bankruptcy, but there is a bankruptcy of ideas, of innovation. That's why the government is being so lazy and complacent and being so highly extractive and taking money from the poor at this central government level. Let me just bring in one other point that the economists will not bring in, which is a political point. Now, if you see the ebb and flow of price rise and decrease, there was a decrease in diesel prices in September. They are directly related to, if you notice carefully, the Bihar elections. We saw the first phase, a continuous and unabated price rise from the 7th of June to the 29th of June. Then on the 30th of June, the Prime Minister announced, mind you, if you recall, the extension of the Gharib Kalyan Yojana, say that it will increase after the Bihar elections till Chhath Puja. When the Bihar elections were approaching, there was a decrease in the prices in September of diesel. And now that the Bihar elections are done and dusted and they've sneaked victory, now you see a sudden increase. I dare say that the increase will continue in some form or the other, in some staggered form of the other, because the government is too unimaginative and highly lazy and unconscionable to do otherwise.
Okay.
Till the next election,
I agree with you, Anshul Avijit. There is a
There is
strategy here and a
this.
smart political strategy here, but let's not call that one unimaginative. I'm sure the Congress party would have done the same in the run-up to any election if you have the chance to do that.
Accusation is not,
We'll find out perhaps some other day. I want to go across to Professor Malhotra, but Aman Agarwal wants to make a point here. Yes, to you first, and then Professor Malhotra. Yes.
Thank you, Tanvi. I have spoken at your channel as well as various other, including Lok Sabha and All India Radio, that the fuel must be included in the GST, even if there has to be a certain surge to balance prices, not to reduce it immediately directly to a very low level of 28% or even lower. But even if you want to increase, put a surcharge on it, but it must be included in the GST. And there is a complete non-coordination and non-support of all states, including the states which are headed by the Congress as well.
Correct.
In terms of wanting to have it in the GST. Why is the other parties where they rule not wanting the fuel prices to come in GST? This will not only reduce the prices, but will also put more cash in a large economy, which is the middle class, in their own home budgets. And I think that's very important because their revenues, their incomes are not going up. Many have lost their job, but at least if there could be a cut in the cost, that will cut the food prices as well as the other prices. It will ultimately, in the long run, benefit, and it has to come in the GST as this government also has been talking about, but there has been complete non-support from all the states, irrespective of whether it is BJP
Actually,
or...
that's a very interesting point and valid point that you've raised repeatedly on camera, though, and in public places. The central government keeps saying we want to discuss and we will bring fuel under GST. We want to build consensus for that, but both BJP and Congress governed states, and of course other opposition party governed states have largely disagreed to that. Professor Malhotra, now that we've spoken about the issues which are there and how we've arrived at this point, the question is, how do we solve this? If the central government says they have no money, the state government says they have no money, so what do we do? Just keep asking the common man to pay the money?
The government has no choice but to borrow more. We've been saying this for 6 months. All sensible economists in the country and abroad who think the well of India have been saying this, that the government needs to borrow more. Very simple. When the 2008 global economic crisis hit the country, which was a much weaker economic crisis, and its impact was much weaker than that of this one, we put in place a fiscal stimulus of 3.5% of GDP. Till today, the three packages taken together, the fiscal part as opposed to the monetary part, the fiscal part is no more than 2% of GDP in a crisis which is much deeper. This is poor management of the economy because it reflects of the poor understanding. A fiscal stimulus means you increase expenditure on the one hand, and on the other hand, you cut taxes. What is the government doing? It is systematically cutting. It is increasing taxes. It is increasing taxes. But, okay, so why did they cut corporate taxes then? And why did they raise the threshold on personal income tax 1 year ago? Because the elections were due. So, look, we have no choice but to borrow more. The government has no choice but to borrow more. And it is refusing to do so. It is simply refusing to do so. This particular rise in price has been made in preparation for the budget, which is just 50 days down the road. And we are waiting to see, because obviously the management of the economy has been such that our contraction has been the worst among G20 countries.
Yeah.
And that's because our fiscal stimulus is as weak as it is. The whole world recognizes that. The IMF recognizes that. All sensible Indian economists recognize that, but no one in the government even understands this.
Okay,
this is public finance 101. Have you cut taxes in this situation?
Yes, no, and to the fiscal stimulus point, because, and I wanted to say this earlier when Mr. Viswas Pathak made the mention of Atmanirbhar Bharat package, is again to say it doesn't directly give money in the hands of poor people, Mr. Viswas Pathak, apart from, of course, giving the welfare that happened in the first few months to say, okay, here is the money to stay alive because you don't have a job and you have nothing else to sustain on. Everything else that's been announced by the government to help the economy has been about more borrowing. It's not essentially more spending. It is more borrowing. I am completely out of time, but Professor Aman Agarwal wanted to make one last point. Yes.
Quickly, I'll make that. And we had fortunately suggested that, and that was creating an oil pool account way back in 1988-89 when N.D. Tiwari ji, the then finance minister, actually implemented it. And the government has been able to create a huge buffer. Even when Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji was the prime minister, he used that part of the oil pool account. Even this government in the first tense used that. And there is buffer oil which is there. So the government must use it to fuel domestic markets. And that was the prime purpose of creating it.
I want to make one point.
Yes.
Created the oil pool account which could be used for this purpose. And they must see that there is stability in the oil prices and reduction so that the common man is not hurt, even if it is for a momentary manner. And they should set the oil companies not to disturb these markets by giving wrong information to the ministers who are actually not briefed, who come and who are not briefed of how oil prices are actually determined.
Yes, and that there is a lag which is there, which always gets forgotten about. But the point that you made, I will emphasize in that again. It's important to know times are different right now. We are in the middle of still reeling under the impact of a pandemic and in a recession right now. There is no two ways about it. Our economy hasn't improved 15% just because our GDP contraction went from 24% to 9%. No, that's not how it works. We are still contracting. We're still shrinking. And that's just bad news. And on top of that, if we are going to deal with high inflation, high prices for our daily essentials, for our food, for our fuel, then that will get taxing for the common man. And perhaps that's not fair. There is merit to what our economists say when they say almost everybody now is saying the government needs to borrow more money. Yes, you have run out of money, but these are unprecedented times. You've cut down on your spending already. You're not spending as much money. Now the only option is to go and borrow more. Don't squeeze whatever is left from your citizens. Because if the price rise continues like this, it's just going to get more and more painful. At what point will the state and the central governments respond is the big question. The states too, remember, have a share of the tax in your fuel price. They too have increased this because they also don't have money. They too can cut it down. So anytime you hear any opposition party put the entire responsibility on the center, keep that in mind. Completely out of time on this conversation. Thank you to our panelists for joining us.